We're gonna keep forward with Gonçalo de Carvalho that worked with different museums, and he's a member of the board of ICOM Portugal since 2020. He holds a degree in history and archaeology from the University of in Lisbon, and has a PhD in archaeology from the University Autónoma de Madrid. Guest lecturer in the master's degree in cultural heritage at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, and researcher at the Institute of Contemporary History at the Universidad de Nova de Lisbon. Author books and articles in scientific journals, including, for example, the Portuguese publication Pessoas, Objetos e Sentimentos, Ensayos Reflexões, Social do Patrimônio, La Trama de los Objetos. Thank you so much for being with us today, Gonçalo. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me for the invitation from Museo de América, Museo de Antropología, and the Ministry of Culture and Sport. I think that is the name in Spain. Actually, no, not really, just culture. I would like to tell you that I will speak Spanish. I've been living with people from Chile, and now I have accent from South America, from Chile, and even when I speak Spanish, I have this accent. I've been receiving some comments about my title, my presentation title. It was kind of controversial. Probably it is in Spanish, but in Portuguese, not really, because we're used to speak a lot and not take a lot of action. So. Before starting, I would like to say that for me it's fundamental that we open this kind of debates about these topics, because I think everybody is learning in Europe about this process, and I think there are not clear solutions yet, and I think the only solution to get results is through debates and a common path. I don't know if you can all hear me well. I will talk this morning. I will give you a lot of information because I will give you an overview of the decolonization of museums in Portugal. I think that we started talking about this topic since the 90s in a more academic context, and after we talked about the diaspora in general, I think that is strengthened in 2017 after the elections of the Lisbon Parliament, where the one that won that was part of the Socialist Party had in its plan a project of creating the Museum of Discoveries of Portugal. And he was taking into account the dynamics of the tourists, that tourists from all the world were relating to Portugal, and so we could actually take some advantages from the tourism, so it was a pragmatic decision, basically. But anyway, the debate was really strong, but the museum was not built. And as we can see, Lisbon has already some hints of that heritage, and probably we will need a museum to deconstruct that maritime past and colonial past. As I was saying, it was a very large and hard debate, and between 2018 and 2022, more than 500 news and articles, opinion articles about the topic were published. Mostly every week we had something new, and we had news even in foreign newspapers. Several debates were held in different communication medias. A lot of experts and specialists were invited. Most of them were remaining more than a week. For example, Louis Bunch, Wayne Modest, and others. I think Hannah is from Tropen Museum. I think so. And all these experts were participating in activities in universities, a different auditorium for big public. Also, it emerged exactly when we were talking about the construction, the building of this museum. And we know the situation of what Macron said, but it was a common topic in that sense. And this topic emerged of the Black Lives Matter. And we have an example right here. This was the statue that was the, I don't really know the word in Spanish. So basically the statue that was painted the most and written on. And we can go on and talk about this because this is a very complex situation and example. In Brazil, this figure, Father Antonio Vieira, was really well appreciated, but it didn't have a really clear position for this situation, so it's been really criticized in Portugal for this topic. So what would the context of the Portuguese museum be related to the not European objects? There's been a lot of debates, especially in the era of COVID. The idea was, since in Portugal we've been talking about a lot about this, to do an inventory. Because, for example, I was laughing with Luis actually when he invited me, because 3 years ago we held a seminary in Portugal and it was really similar to this one. And there was also a representative of the Africa Museum. We also had a representative of the World Museum in Austria and a representative from Germany. And we tried to learn with these countries that already were very advanced in this process of restitution. And we thought that at the beginning the question was just get to know the objects that we had in the museums. So how did these objects arrive to the museum? So we did a survey, kind of a survey, and I think it was a failure. That's my opinion. You can read here some of the news of the newspaper in Portugal. Of course, it's in Portuguese, but Portuguese is very similar to Spanish for those of you who speak Spanish. As you can see, only 45 museums answered to the surveys, participated in the surveys out of 414 museums. And some of them were not even museums, but anyway, the number was really low. Here we have exactly the survey that we carried out. It was really simple. It didn't have a lot of questions, a lot of points, but basically what we were interested in was basically what were the kind of collections they had, if they studied the collections, and especially if they used them for exhibitions, because they had some just saved and they didn't use them. So as I was saying, those 45 museums they answered, especially in November, and after that we tried to extend the survey until December 2021, and at the end we had more answers, especially national museums, because they felt the pressure of participating. As you can see here in the screen, out of 414 museums, there was a residual participation of the 16%. And we can see a significant participation in a part of Portugal, because as you know, Portugal has two autonomous areas, which is Azores Island and Madeira Island. And as you can see, in the Azores Island, the percentage was a little higher. Also, we had some museums that considered that they didn't have anything representative of the colonization era. They didn't have to answer, but actually the survey was for everybody. Out of those museums, 52, so basically the 78% of the responses declared that they had in their museums objects that were not European. 15 of them said no, they didn't have any. And we also asked the question about basically if they had some collections before the Convention of UNESCO, 1970, because this is framework, of course, in this process. And as you can see, the 74% of the collections that were not European got in before 1970. Even if the commission that was created and leader by the actual, the current, director of the museum, claim basically that they bought the collections in a fair process. Only the 78% declared that they had collections of objects not European before the convention. The type of museums that answered, that participated to the survey, but the majority of them were municipal museums, basically, so urban museums. After we had a number of regional museums, only 4 national museums answered, 7 of foundation, 5 of university, 6 private, and other categories. And this is very important, because only 4 national museums answered. The participation of the majority of the university museums was really relevant, because they are museums that have different collections that comes from this expedition of this century. And they also have, for example, some animal rests or plant rests, so they have a lot of quantities of these objects, and I think it's very impressive. I think Hannah saw some of them. Mostly we had history and art museums participating, and we had also a number of science museums and ethnographic museums. I have to say that those 2 categories, science and ethnographic, were basically the main museums that answered. The majority of what they had was basically 31% of art collections, 29% of ethnographic, and 14% it was archaeological. And about the scientific collections, there were historical, natural, there were residuals, not a lot, because of course we have more history museums. But if we compare it, of course, it's also important. About the quantities of pieces or objects, we only had 5 museums of those out of those who answered with more than 5,000 objects. So basically the 3 university museums that I mentioned before, of Lisbon, Coimbra, and Porto. It was the historical museum, and also the national one of archaeology. These was the 5 museums that answered and that have more than 5,000 pieces. And after that, we had a reduced number with a value between 3,000 and 5,000, and the general answer was between 100 and 1,000. The geographic area of the collections was a surprise for us, but the big majority of the objects were from Asia. And I think this can be related to the prolongation of what Macau was, which theoretically was connected to Portugal until 2000, more or less. And also with the fact that the only region that had a sub-Rome was India, basically, and they had the right to have this kind of power. And a big part of the powerful families of Portugal, they owned objects that had that precedence. So that's why we have a lot of presence of objects, especially in the context of our museums. Of course, this relation with South America for Brazil and Africa. As you know, the colonization of Africa in Portugal was really late, and it ended in 1975. We can see Asiatic collection, African collections. About the percentages of the objects that were in the inventory. This is very interesting to see. Only 66% of the total had more of the 90% of the objects that were in the inventory. So it's a very high percentage. There's a very high percentage, more than the 30, that do not have the majority of the objects that were part of the inventory, and this is a problem for me. And I think a bigger problem is which objects of those origins were studied. And we can see that only the 19% of the museums that answered claimed that their collections were correctly studied. So we are at a percentage of more than 90%, and 56% declare that their collection are partially not studied. So basically under the 50% of the collection. And I think this is very relevant, especially if we're doing a restitution process. I would like to show you now what is exactly, what are the objects in the Portuguese museums. This is just an example. I can't show everything. I don't really know how to, what word to use. In Spanish, and this is something in Portugal is called art of the maritime expansion. I called it here colonial art in general. But what is it exactly, this kind of art? We have some pieces, some objects manufactured with raw materials that come from out of Europe, from Asia, from Africa, that have a common point. They've been manufactured from people from those countries, but they have some features of the Portuguese world and art, so it's very difficult to place these objects in a process of restitution. After, we have the collection of naturalists of the Enlightenment, and about this collection, it was one of the major collection. It had different problems before the French invasion, after a big fire that the Natural History Museum had. But some masks survived the fire, and apparently these masks are really rare to find in Brazil, because it was a collection of an exhibition of the 18th century. We also have different animals that come from this scientific expedition of the Enlightenment, and this is something less frequent but also common in Portuguese museums. As you can see, also these kind of objects that come from different countries of the 15th centuries. Here we have pieces that are from the period after the Berlin Conference that were manufactured in Africa. These are some examples, and some of them you can tell what is the general aspect of them. And after that, also some scientific purchases of the second half of the 20th century. Some of them are more or less recent, from the 90s. And according to the current director of the museum, this museum has the most important collections of Brazil out of the Brazilian region, and they are now in a process. They don't really exhibit them. You have to ask for an appointment if you want to see them and visit the collection. And according to the words, as I was saying before, the director of the museum, it was a really fair process in the 90s, and the indigenous people decided what they consider very important to exhibit, and they were paid for that. For example, there were just a community that had some equipment for the village. And in this final part, I would like to show you how museums have worked with this collection in the last years. I have just a selection. I could talk about, for example, of the exhibition in Europe, but since it was a transnational exhibition with different states and with artists of the diaspora, it's a little complicated, so I would focus on this selection I made, that was made by Portugal. I could talk about different artists from Portugal that are very well known in the sector, but I think it was more of a modern exhibition, and of course outside of Portugal. I would like to talk about a special exhibition that was made in the Padrão dos Descobrimentos. You saw that at the beginning, and they went through a very interesting process. So since we have these monuments, they went through a reconstruction and process, basically, and they start from the idea that there's not just one Africa, there's more of one. Of course, we cannot compare with museums of the Netherlands, of Belgium, for example. We have very little exhibition, but we do our best. So where in this occasion, a lot of experts and people coming from African communities were invited, and they chose one of the objects, and they were trying to describe, basically with a sentence, that object. The exhibition had very important pieces that were chosen by 43 specialists and experts. As you can see, one of the image I'm presenting is just a shirt or a t-shirt of Eusebio. And Eusebio is a very well-known figure, person in Portugal, and he has some African descendants, so this is related. We have other different pieces, there are more contemporary, but we also have different elements. There are more biological that could represent Africa. So we have pieces of different nature and different ideas and concepts to show this diversity that Africa has, especially history and microhistories related to the to every pieces, so they could contribute to the plural history of Africa. Another very interesting exhibition. You can see the title in the screen. I actually got it wrong, but it's more or less that one. And it was about the colonial archive of this museum. They have mostly all the documents of this process, of this exploration process. And what they did with this was working with these objects and with some contemporary artists. They tried to build a critique of the scientific study and investigation that was carried out in Africa. And it was basically scientific objects of the exhibition realized in different colonized territory by Portugal between the 19th century and the 20th century. You can see here some images of the science that has been defined, racist science. And to wrap up, and I would say I would like to explain my title of the presentation. So, a lot of words and little action. I would like to tell you that recently a new museum has been inaugurated and a new exhibition in it. And this is a museum that has some work of arts of a collectionist. And these works were done in the last 20 years. So after the convention of 1970, and the objective of this collection is just show the beauty, the aesthetical beauty of Asia, basically. In this, Hannah was there, but at that time the museum was not inaugurated yet. You can see another example of the collections of Museo de Ciencia de la Universidad. And the objective was represent the concept of a museum that was something similar of the exhibition of the 15th, 16th centuries. And you know that Coimbra, for example, has only exhibition after the 18th century, so this is very weird. But in this case, we had human rests or animal remains. Human remains or animal remains, and this was very weird. And I'm ending my presentation here. Thank you so much.